Hey class, it's your professor, and I'm going to talk about chapter 24 as well as I can and hopefully keep it within 30 minutes or so. That's my goal. So, thank you very much for not being in class, I guess, on Wednesday, and I won't be there as well. You should be able to see the PowerPoint slide now and my ugly mug over in the corner. But chapter 24 has a lot of stuff in it, and I want to go through it as well as I can in an efficient way. So, you see some of the images from hotels to fallout shelters to TV sets to I Love Lucy on Life magazine to cars with fins. Some of the awesomest cars in American history come out of the 1950s if you're a car fan. But suburbs, consumerism, the Cold War, Eisenhower, teenage angst, suburban angst, and civil rights are some of the topics that we'll be trying to talk about in the next few minutes or so. But uh, the elections of 1952 and 56 were elections that were landslides won by the World War II hero, General Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower picked as his vice president, as I said to you in class on Monday. Interesting guy, Richard Nixon, down here is seen with his wife Pat. Nixon made his name by fighting against the communists in the House and then the Senate, and then saved his career with what was called the Checkers speech during the campaign. He actually was accused of taking bribes and probably did take bribes, but he said he played every emotion he could on television with a speech and brought out his wife and talked about his two young daughters and said the only thing that I ever took from anyone was this dog named Checkers, and basically darned if I ever give that dog back, it would make my girls cry. And it saved his political career. He's a man who always seemed to stick around. But Eisenhower was very popular. Eisenhower was somebody who was a war hero. He kept the New Deal, tried to make the New Deal better. He said he was going to be a compassionate conservative Republican president, but in a country that was overwhelmingly Democratic, he had to do those sorts of things at the time, working most of the time with a Democratic Congress. Um, Eisenhower in the Cold War tried not to have hot wars. He ended the Korean War in his first year as president. He thought the way to defend against the Soviet Union was not to have a massive conventional army, but to have a large number of nuclear warheads. And you see the number of nuclear warheads going up. That was my phone just falling during his administration from very few, the bottom chart down here, to rising quite a bit during his time as president and even further after that. At one time in the 1960s, we had as many as 35 nuclear bombs. The Soviet Union had as many as 45, 50,000 during the 1980s, and we still had 25,000 bombs at the time, but it really crested and starts to rise during Eisenhower's time. He thought the only way to avoid nuclear war was to have as many bombs as possible and assure mutually assured destruction, which was called MAD, M-A-D. We did lots of stuff, to stave off communism in the Middle East, Southeast Asia. We did covert operations. What Eisenhower wanted to do is what they called global containment, which is continuing the policies of containment of George Kennan in the 1940s, but doing it, all around the world. And there was even an attempt at times to roll back communism, not just to contain communism, but those attempts were limited. Some of the hot spots, this was really a important hot spot, was French Indochina, which is Vietnam. We had an agreement with South Vietnam. This is Vietnam here, and the southern part of Vietnam was friendly, not democratic, but friendly. And the northern part of Vietnam was controlled by the communists. Again, close to China, China, and then Korea. There was sort of a communist wall being built in that area. And there was no war yet between the United States and the Vietnamese, but the French fought a war and lost. And then from 1954 until about 1962, 63, there was a very tenuous peace in Vietnam, and we were getting more and more involved. And it's going to lead to some other issues coming up in the next couple of chapters. But Uh, we were fighting the culture war. Eisenhower was very much in support of that. We had Free Europe, we had Voice of America, they had cultural ambassadors around the world, entertainment and entertainers, folks who were well-known actors and singers would go around the world supporting American ideas and causes and trying to reinforce American culture in places in Western Europe and Central Europe and other places around the globe. And the key in the 50s, in the 40s, it was giving money, and we still gave money in the 50s. In the 40s and 50s, defending communism against communism in the Korean War. But one of the keys in the 50s was this idea of rolling back communism and using the CIA to do that. And there's two good examples of how we did that. One was with getting rid of this guy, Mohammad Mossadegh, in Iran and replacing him with sponsoring a CIA-led coup, get rid of this elected official, and replacing him with the Shah of Iran, who would run Iran for the next 25 years, and basically was friendly to the United States, but terrorized his own people. He was our friend, so we overlooked a lot of the things he did that was just awful. Same thing happened in Guatemala. Here's a picture of Richard Nixon meeting with Armaz, who was the general that took over in 1954 after the CIA helped to get rid of Guzman Arbenz, who was the elected leader of Guatemala. It sent Guatemala into a civil war that lasted over 30 years. 30 years. I can't say that more. So this was, successful in stopping the growth of communism, successful air quotes, maybe turning back the growth of communism, maybe in some of these places, especially in Guatemala, but at great cost to the people of these countries and long-term chaos and long-term animosity, especially in Iran, toward the Americans who supported the Shah for a quarter of a century. So that's the foreign policy of Eisenhower. And how am I doing on time? Yeah, that's running a long time already. Okay. Domestic policies, he supported suburban sprawl. He supported urban renewal, which was to tear down dilapidated buildings, poor slums, and build public housing to help develop central business districts and help get highways that would get into and out of cities very quickly. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 actually was a defense budget initiative that revolutionized the way that we get from point A to point B around this whole country. It was interstate highways that like Highway 95 and Highway 76 and Highway 78 and Highway 80 and every highway with those blue signs, the interstate highways were built or started to be built with money from the 1956 Federal Highway Act, including bypasses, 295 and 495, and all these 695, the one through Baltimore. These are all being built, 41,000 total miles of roads at $30 billion, which, today's dollars is astronomical, to help, get people into and out of cities quickly, to get people around cities, to help develop the suburbs. And this was, game changing for the way cities developed. It was game changing for where people could live. I live 85 miles away from Mercer, and I could not work at Mercer if it was 1955 before the federal highway system because I use highways. I use 476 or I use Highway 78. And I get to Mercer in an hour and 30 or 40 minutes on a good day. Whereas if I didn't have those highways to do that, I would be getting to Mercer in 2.5, 3 hours to get there. And you can't do that. So anyway, I digress like I generally do. Eisenhower's policies were also trying to, at a time when the economy was very strong, as I said before in class, a lot of the foreign aid was a way to boost the economy. We were still supplying the world with steel, and we were still supplying the world our exports were incredibly high compared to our imports at a time very few folks had recovered yet from World War II. At least the Western industrial societies had not recovered from it. So we were still making and supplying the world with goods. We had, like it says here, we had a $5 billion export import surplus. which is astronomical compared to, to today. We have a deficit by many, many times more than that. Our GMP was up, our income was up, our inflation was low, unemployment was low. Um, this was the time when, people who had jobs, most of you, were doing okay. You're doing better than you did in previous decades. And especially if you had a union job, it was a time when things were pretty good for most Americans. And um, despite the fact that you had many white suburban Americans, white, small town Americans doing quite well, there was a lot of still problems. And some of these things talk about problems, especially inner city minorities had problems, small farmers were having problems. Many farmers felt themselves being pushed off of farms at this time by larger scale corporate farms, and they were moving to work in factories. Many people in my family, that's the time they stopped being farmers in the 1950s, and they start moving and working in factories. Some people who were living in areas that didn't have unions or where unionization was very marginalized. There were still a number of female-headed households, and we had a lot of wealth, and the wealth was distributed amongst people better perhaps than it would be before the 1950s and better than it will be today, but still there was a lot of poverty. And one of the problems that we faced was oil. 1953 here was the first time we imported more oil than we exported. This would only be a growing problem in the next 30 years of American history. There would be major crises in the 70s, especially when it comes to oil. Uh, One of the keys of the 50s boom economically was consumerism. And these areas of modern technology, and highways and vacations, credit and consumerism, and cars were things that kind of were hallmarks of the success or the excess, depending on who you are, of American consumerism. These are all slides with pictures you can see on the class. So I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly. Modern technologies, people had to have these things in their homes, everything from toasters to vacuum cleaners to coffee makers to rotisserie ovens to clocks, alarm clocks to blenders to refrigerators. Refrigerators the first time, washers and dryers and radios and televisions and you name the stuff, everything seemed to be electronic. These were the things, even electric can opener, which I always find funny because who in the world would ever need an electric can opener? Electric shavers, in your home phonographs in your bedroom. You can for only $20, you could buy a record player to play records in your bedroom. And this was a game changer for many young people, especially teenagers who could buy, you know, albums or 45s and play them in their own bedrooms. But having a phone, this is a humorous thing. What a housewife, of course, a sex stereotype of a housewife having a phone not only downstairs but paying a little bit extra to having a phone also upstairs, so she wouldn't have to run up and down the stairs to answer the phone while she's doing her housework and her chores, which I think is hilarious. But anywho, I hope you're all still listening. Cars here. I love these cars, fancy, convertibles and fins, and nobody had a seatbelt, and everything's made out of hard steel, and there's no give to anything. And these were heavy cars, and they were big engines, and they went fast, and they were dangerous as all can be. But every color you can imagine, every style you can imagine, and the textbook talks about, Ford and consumerism and new cars, and it just becomes sort of a hallmark of the United States and American economy to have these fancy fandangled cars at a time when nobody else in the world was producing cars that were just so audacious compared to the rest of the world. And then there's vacations, where people had these roads to go on and travel, and people would go on vacations and all across the country, or gas stations and restaurants and hotels and historic landmarks and amusement parks and all sorts of things that were popping up all along these highways. And the number one vacation destination of the 1950s, at least for the West Coast, was Disneyland, opening in the middle 1950s. And of course, Vice President Richard Nixon was right there on day one when that opened. And Disneyland had places that epitomize American society, and it had everything from Adventureland and Frontierland and Fantasyland and Main Street America and Recreation Land and Tomorrowland. And this was America at its best, or America at its worst, depending on who you were and who you thought, or what you thought at the time, I guess. But and then there's also the 50s were the first time we had actual credit cards. There was credit before, and there was problems with credit in the 20s, but now we've got credit cards, and we've got department stores, and we've got grocery stores, and we got shopping malls. We have fast food restaurants that are national chains, and everything from Howard Johnson hotels to McDonald's being built for the first time in the 50s to shopping centers and things like that. Really, when it came right down to it, all this stuff that I just went through very quickly, time-wise, okay, we're doing okay. Uh, our stuff defined us. There was a World Expo in Moscow in 1959, and here again is Richard Nixon, who went to it, and standing next to him in Moscow is the leader of the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. This is Nikita Khrushchev. And when the Americans went to Moscow, Khrushchev said, "This is what we think of America." And they made a kitchen, and it had all the appliances, and it had a washer and a dryer and a dishwasher, and it had electric can opener and all these things that are in an American kitchen. And Nixon said, "Wow, that's great. I can't believe you did this. This is great. It really does define us. And we're so proud that you made a kitchen for us." And but in essence, Khrushchev was actually mocking the United States, saying that, why does anyone need all this stuff? And Nixon said, of course, Americans need all this stuff. And it was a very big juxtaposition of two different worlds at the same time. You know, uh, yeah, fun stuff, right? Uh, this was all within, the suburban sprawl. Everybody can be a homeowner. Levittown, New Jersey, Levittown, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Levittown, New York. There are, homes, small homes at the time, two, three-bedroom homes, suburban tract housing with a one-car garage was something that was very much in reach of most workers who had a good job in the 1950s, which was, half of the country, maybe more than half the country. And you can get low interest loans that were funded by the federal government, long-term low interest loans, and suburbanization was something that was big and supported by the government, and something that many folks desired as well. There were some good things, affordable housing and safe neighborhoods, and there were some bad things. Even today, when you see a new development going up in an area, there's oftentimes flooding, or there's sometimes, movement of the ground, and other problems with the ecological issues. And usually in the 50s, when you had a new suburb, it was a segregated population. Oftentimes, minorities, African Americans especially, were not allowed to purchase homes in suburbs because there was no law against it. And oftentimes there either was outright segregation or de facto segregation, not allowing minority groups to buy homes. Sometimes that even meant certain ethnic groups and religious groups, especially some folks that were like not Christians. But again, there were no laws against that in the 1950s. And of course, we know from class that there were some serious issues with all these things at the time. So anyway, as the book talks about as well, one of the things about suburbia, community in suburbia, what do you look for? We become a very the nation of joiners. We're looking for some kind of, we lost community in our city, or our old neighborhoods in small towns and communities, and we're looking for something that's going to make us feel connected in some way in these suburbs. So there were lots of lodges, fraternal associations, leagues. A revival of religion, church membership rose tremendously, almost doubled in the course of the 40s to the 60s, as the book talks about. Even Congress reacts to that. And on money, we put "In God We Trust" for the first time in 1957. In the Pledge of Allegiance, "Under God" goes into that for the first time in 1954. It wasn't there before that. So, you know, a way for us to sort of find meaning in the suburbs, a way for us to compare ourselves, or compare ourselves positively to the atheistic communists in the Soviet Union. Go to church, go to join a church, support religion, and whether you believe or not, at least make believe you believe, or find a way. I don't want to get into that too much, but all right. Uh, First decade of television was the 1950s, and TV shows like I Love Lucy, even I Love Lucy, by the end of her show moves out to the suburbs in Connecticut. Starting there. Shows like over here, Ozzie and Harriet, the Nelson Family, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best. So many stories that all center around the nuclear family, the mom, dad, and two or three children living in a suburb. And very few programs had people of color. Very few programs had people who were ethnic or religious minorities. It was a very lily white America and a very suburban America that was portrayed on television. Of course, there were some issues, organization men, the mindless suburban middle class job of a salesman or of an office worker. A guy, a guy named White wrote a book called The Organization Man, where said that men are going to having nervous breakdowns, drinking because there's no hope, and they feel very emasculated in this modern society. The work, the male work is becoming something that they, doesn't, it's not defining them as men any longer. And same with women as well. Women became very much the June Cleaverization, the housewife and mother, of everything from the First Lady, Mamie Eisenhower, to famous folks, the cook, the recipe, the cookbook maker, Betty Crocker, and others. They're pushing you, as we said in class on Monday, pushing you to become a housewife and mother and not anything more. This is tremendous. Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee for president twice in the 1950s, gave a speech to the graduating class at the all-women's college, Smith College, and said to these graduates, embrace the role of the humble housewife, which like these are all college graduates. And he said, this is what your job is going to be now that you're a college graduate. You're going to be a humble housewife. So gosh, read this. This is hilarious. I'm not going to go over it. Read this. One thing that happens in the suburbs, because there is affluence and money and access to cars, there becomes like a teen culture. Rebels Without a Cause in your textbook, Elvis, the singer. Even in this, we have folks that are minorities, like Little Richard, and sort of a very offbeat kind of culture with the Beats, the Beatniks, they're derogatorily called. All kinds of movies that talk about science fiction, critical of society, critical of the suburbs. We've got movies that are critical of teen culture, movies that sort of are talking about juvenile delinquency and issues of that. And we have music that is for the first time uh, threatening, not the first time, but it's music that threatens this sort of status quo, this box that you're trying to be pushed into. Music by R&B artists, music by country singers, music by now this new thing of rock and roll music, music by Chuck Berry, music by Little Richard, music by Elvis Presley. The first song, Rock Around the Clock, by Bill Haley and the Comets, sort of opens up this idea of rock and roll music. Chuck Berry and Little Richard, African American artists singing, Sweet Little 16 and Tutti Frutti, and Elvis Presley being sort of this white rock star for the first white rock star you've ever had in American history, and becoming sort of the Beatles before the Beatles. We have the Beatles coming up in the next chapter mentioned there, but Elvis Presley, who was doing things on stage that was incredibly risque. They nicknamed him Elvis the Pelvis because of his gyrations when he would sing, which was very traumatic to your grandparents or your great grandparents who tried to keep your grandparents away from the watching the Ed Sullivan Show or other shows that might show this man dancing a little bit on television. So I'm not going to go into some of these things because they're in the textbook, and there are some extremes of culture. Even though the 50s are pretty much straight-laced, there are some examples of some folks who were living and operating outside the box, but they were marginalized, and they were sometimes ridiculed, and they were sometimes made fun of. And these were things that were quite serious, but they lived at the edge of 1950s culture. Trying to do a lot in a short period of time. So please, I'm appreciative that you're still here with me, and I hope that I'm going fast, but I hope I'm not going too fast. Finally, there's this civil rights, and I'm going through these things only to say that there is a buildup, and the book talks about the buildup, and really the first big breakthrough trying to defeat segregation is the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Brown case, which says that separate but equal is not equal. This is something you need to know what this is. If you don't know what this is, you need to know. It's the first time you said in schools, you can't have a black school and a white school. They're not equal. I don't care if everything in them is the same. They're not equal because it denotes that there is a superior and an inferior. Um, the Supreme Court rules this in 1954. It's a very slow process to actually integrate schools, but it's the beginning of this process. This is the law. You need a law to change society, and this is the Supreme Court ruling. You need the law on your side. This is the one. From that, you can go and do things to try to make that law apply. This is where we get things like this is where we get things like the Little Rock Nine. These folks tried to actually go to Little Rock High School, and 9 black kids went to the high school. And in a day or two, the governor was trying very hard to stop this. And within a few days, you had this happening in Little Rock. You had thousands of federal troops making sure that these 9 black kids can go to high school. And this is what it looked like in outside of Little Rock High School. This is what it looked like when some of the kids would sleep overnight in the high school, when the troops would sleep overnight in the high schools, because people with guns protecting the 9 black young people in the high school. This was America. What do you do to try to fight this? Well, the governor of Little Rock shut down the high schools for a whole year to try to stop segregation. But what happens because of that? There's another Supreme Court case, and Cooper versus Aaron in 1959 said that you can't shut down schools to avoid inaction of Brown versus Board. Even with all this, it's a very slow process. 11 years after Brown, only 2% of American schools were integrated. And that's a sad number. That's 11 years after Brown versus Board, but it's a beginning. The law is on your side. You just got to get the law enforced, and that's the hardest part. So from law, now you have the law on your back. You can also then move to mass action. And the most important thing from this chapter when it comes to mass action for civil rights is, of course, the Montgomery bus boycott. When Rosa Parks, seen here, refused to give up her seat in the black section of the bus to a white man who wanted it. She wasn't sitting in the front of the bus. She was sitting in the back of the bus. And she got arrested for that. It led to a boycott that lasted for almost a year. And at the end of this boycott, there was another Supreme Court case, that said you can't segregate on buses. You cannot do these things. This is the time when the man who comes to Montgomery and leads the Montgomery Improvement Association is Martin Luther King Jr. He was only 26 years old. It's interesting to know that if he had lived beyond when he was killed in 1968, he might still be alive today. He'd be 94 years old, which is quite old, but he'd be 94 years old, which I know people who are 94 years old. He still could be alive. He certainly would have been alive from, into the 2000s, you would assume. What could he have done? But he was sadly killed before he turned even 40 years old. So he did everything he accomplished before he was 40. But here, King helps lead the boycott. He gets again in the Supreme Court case coming in saying you can't do this. The law is on your side. And at the end of this, King forms this group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which will be a backbone to the 1960s civil rights movement. He'll lead this organization for many years. I will talk about this briefly. The civil rights. This is Emmett Till. This is Emmett Till, a young boy. And this is Emmett Till, a corpse. I show this to you only because his mother wanted the world to see what racism looks like. Emmett Till was a Chicagoan who went down south and supposedly said something, said something to a cashier, a white woman who was a teenager herself, but she was married, an older teacher, 19, and she was married. This boy was only 4 years younger than her. And because he did that, the woman's husband and was woman's friends, went to his family's home, his relation's home, took him out of the house away, And the next time they found him in a river and he was drowned, beaten and drowned. The men who took him said, "We just talked to him and let him go. I don't know how he died." And an all-white jury acquitted the men. They were arrested, tried, and they were acquitted, let go because they were found not guilty. That's American civil rights justice of the 50s, or injustice. All right. National level, there were some civil rights bills, but both of them are very weak. Nothing seriously was done. Eisenhower wasn't a big fan of civil rights. Lyndon Johnson was trying to push through. He was in the Senate at this time, civil rights bills, but largely nothing was could be done at the highest levels. But everything is being done by advocates at the lower levels, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Rosa Parkses, the Thurgood Marshalls, who was a lawyer for Brown versus Board of Education. These are positive, solid steps forward for civil rights, and you know, it's going to take off in the 60s, but there was a very solid, sound foundation in the 1950s that were given to civil rights in the movement through Brown versus Board of Education, a number of other Supreme Court cases, and mass action through what was happening at in Montgomery, Alabama, with the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm going to leave this to the next class when we get to the 1960s, the election of 60s and the end of your chapter 24. And I'm not going to get into that right now. What happens? Nixon doesn't go away, yada, yada, yada. But I want to thank you for staying with me for so long. I've been talking for, it seems like forever, I know. And I'm going to stop sharing, and you're going to see my ugly big face here all of a sudden. But thanks for staying so long. I think this has now been a long time talking, so I will not keep you any longer other than your assignment. Your assignment for uh, this class is to watch the class. And when you're done with the class, please tell me what you think is the most important. What's the most important uh, part uh, of this presentation? Was it civil rights? And if so, tell me why in a sentence. Was it suburbanization? Was it consumerism? Was it the Cold War? Tell me what you think was the most important part of chapter 24 and why. That's all. I just want to show me you've listened. Use something from what I just said. Tell me what you think is important and why. So thanks for listening. I appreciate your time. I hope that you have a good week. I hope that you come back on Monday ready to learn about chapter 25 with 1960s and beyond. So have a good weekend and farewell. Auf Wiedersehen. I got to stop this somehow.